Welcome everybody. So this is my 1,000 kilometer, 600 mile comprehensive break-in review for the Honda Trail 125. All of the pros, all of the cons, and all of my thoughts so far with owning this bike. Now back when I got this bike, I was giddy. I was excited. I was borderline goofy. So am I still? Yeah, I think I am. I equate my experience with the Trail 125 in many ways to the feeling I get when I ride my Brompton. In many ways, they are similar. My Brompton is to my Specialized as my Trail 125 is to my Himalayan. It's my silly, fun, commuter and play bike to the much larger and more serious adventure bike, but yet still just as capable. Well, almost. So in short, the Trail 125 just serves a different purpose, or purposes, as compared to the Himalayan. And in that context, I am absolutely thrilled with it. I think it's important that I give you a few disclaimers and disclosures. First, my Trail 125 is essentially stock. I have no performance upgrades on the bike. It has the stock exhaust, the stock plug, the stock battery, the stock air filter, the stock ECU. All of my upgrades that I've done on the Trail 125 have been functional in nature, not performance-based. Now, my motivation for buying the Trail 125 was essentially twofold. First, I wanted a scooter replacement that would primarily serve as a commuter vehicle, as well as a vehicle I could goof off on the forest roads behind my house. I did not buy the Trail 125 for long-distance moto camping or multi-day adventures. I've got the Himalayan for that. Now, the second reason I got the Trail 125, I fully admit, was for the nostalgia. I grew up in my early years riding a Trail 90 up at my grandma's cabin in upstate New York, and when I saw that they re-released this bike, and I knew I was looking for a replacement for my scooter, it seemed like a perfect fit. Now, the last thing I want to say before I get into the review is that this video is going to be a lot of me just talking. And I do apologize for that, but I think it's really important that I be as detailed and thorough as possible. If you're watching this video just like I was a year ago, scouring YouTube for Trail 125 videos, you're undoubtedly in a position where you're trying to decide if you want to buy one of these because you have a very specific goal or purpose in mind for this bike, and you want to know all the little details, even the ones no one's talking about, because I think it's important that you have all the information so you can make the best and most well-informed decision. All right, so I'm feeling good. Let's start with the pros. First things first, the Trail 125 is incredibly small and very light, which means you can take it just about anywhere, like on this sand that I'm going through right now, with almost no fear. Now, along those lines, this bike is actually incredibly capable for what it is. Now, certainly it's limited by its ground clearance and its overall torque, but this thing can tractor up some of the most ridiculous terrain that's out there. If you've watched any of my single track videos, you know that I've taken this thing on places I wouldn't dream of taking my Himalayan, despite its small size, its small displacement, and its street tires. So what that all means is that this bike is just really good for experimenting. If there are sections of trail that you've just been really nervous to take your $10,000, 450-pound adventure bike on because you're worried about dropping it, that's what this bike is for. Get out there, play around with it on this little 250-pound bike, and if you start feeling comfortable on it, that's when you start bringing your larger bike out. There are sections of trail that I can now take my Himalayan on because I've gotten so comfortable with them on this bike. Now, the next big positive for this bike is that it makes an absolutely perfect commuter vehicle. I take this into work every day now. I take it down to the coffee shop. I take it to the grocery store to pick up groceries. I take it just about everywhere. Now, that's not to say that a scooter isn't also a great commuter vehicle, in many ways even better because of the storage. So say you've got that coffee shop that's down the road, but you don't want to take the primary road and there's a little shortcut trail through the woods. This bike can do it, whereas a traditional scooter might not. Now, that leads directly into the next pro for this bike, which is that it gets absolutely ridiculous fuel economy. So I just got finished filling up my tank, and I put just a touch over 1 gallon in the tank, and I had ridden 130 miles. When I did the back of the envelope calculation, it came out to be 122 miles per gallon. So what that means is that even though this bike only has a 1.4 gallon tank, you can expect to get over 150 miles on a tank. So the next pro for this bike is that, at least so far, seems like it's quite simple to maintain. And on top of that, the service intervals aren't bad. They're 4,000 miles. So what this means is that this bike is actually very approachable by anyone with a few tools and a place to work on a bike. The oil changes on this bike are some of the easiest I've ever done. Even adjusting the valves is quite simple on this bike, and it's not some kind of scary boogeyman that you've got to take it into the shop for. However, with that said, if you do have to take it into the shop for a more substantial service, it's a Honda, right? Which means that there's a huge dealer network and service network. Now, speaking of Honda, the next big pro is that, well, it's a Honda, right? Just the name alone means that it's going to be reliable, it has brand name recognition, and it's going to hold its value. I think another really strong positive of this bike is that it simply makes a fantastic bike to learn on or to start on. Because it's so light, because it's so flickable, because it's so capable, but also just so unintimidating. This is a great bike if you just want to get into riding, or maybe you've got a 16-year-old daughter or son that really wants to start learning how to ride, or maybe you need to take your test. This is the bike. You can take it off-road, you can take it on-road, you can take it on trails, you can experiment on it, you can take it just about anywhere without that creeping fear or doubt or worry that you're going to drop the bike. In addition, this bike has a semi-auto clutch, so you don't even have to worry about feathering the clutch or, getting fancy with the clutch. I mean, obviously that's a skill you'll want to learn, but if you're just starting out, this is such a good bike because you can avoid all of that. You can just learn how to ride, learn how to develop your riding skills themselves, and then move on to something else. So speaking of capability, I just think it's worth noting that I believe a positive of this bike is actually that the stock tires are surprisingly adequate on this bike. I've taken this thing on some of the wildest back roads, single tracks, technical, sand, you name it. And while these tires are certainly not perfect, you're never going to have a perfect multi-purpose tire, they've done surprisingly well. So I just wanted to say, yep, they're not perfect, but I don't think you need to run out and immediately buy some ridiculous knobbies for this thing, because these stock tires, I've been quite content with them. So along the lines of adequate response and performance, I do think it's worth noting that the brakes on the 125 are pretty darn good as well. I've had no complaints. They don't feel squishy, they respond quickly, and they have good stopping power. So yeah, they're not Brembos, but you know what? They're pretty darn good, and I've been quite happy with them. All right, so moving on to some quick ones. Another pro. I think this bike is really comfortable, and I think that's worth noting. Another pro. Despite the lack of underseat storage, this bike has a lot of storage potential, especially with the enormous rear rack. Now, another thing I think that's a positive about this bike, and maybe not everyone would agree, but the fact that it is such a conversation starter. I can't tell you how many times someone has pulled me aside or asked me what this is, or when did I buy it, or how do I like it, and you can just see kind of that glow in their eyes, and you know that they probably have a similar story like I did, where they rode one of these as a kid, or their neighbor had one, or maybe they spent some time in the summer up at a farm where there was one, or everybody seems to have a Trail 90 or a Trail 70 story from their childhood. All right, so while I'm making a pit stop here, I can move on to the next two pros of the bike, which I think are kind of only half positives, because I think they also come with half negatives, and that is the ground clearance and the suspension. Now, obviously, the ground clearance is not a lot, but I've been surprised at how adequate it is. I've gone over some really crazy stuff, and only twice have I actually scraped bottom. So yes, if you're going to go out on some crazy technical trails, you're going to be bottoming out all the time. But if you're doing this kind of stuff, and even if you're on some moderate single track, it's actually not too bad. Now, as far as the suspension goes, a lot of people talk crap about the suspension on this little bike. A lot of people spend hundreds of dollars upgrading the suspension on this bike, and I sort of assumed that I was going to have to do that as well. But I've been riding this thing for 600 miles, and I've had no real complaints with the suspension. Is it magnificent? No. Have I bottomed it out a few times? You bet. However, I don't feel the need to go out and spend over $1,000 on suspension upgrades just for those handful of times I might go down a large step where I'm going to bottom out the forks or something. So on all of the single track stuff I've done, even the places where I've gotten the bike stuck, and gone down larger rock steps, I've, for the most part, had no trouble with the suspension, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 times when it did bottom out. So all I'm trying to say is that, is the suspension great? No. But is it decent? Yeah. Considering the bike, I think it's actually pretty good. Couple of other small things I think are worth noting. This bike actually comes with a skid plate, which is pretty cool. I didn't even have to buy an aftermarket skid plate, and I'll tell you, I've definitely scraped it a few times. Another thing I think that's worth noting is that the air intake does have a snorkel, which you know, if you're going to take this thing through some really deep puddles, that's a nice feature to have. I have not personally tested this theory, but I've seen some ridiculous videos on YouTube of people riding these things, you know, all the way up to here in puddles or in water, and more power to them. That's not my jam, but it is nice to at least have that feature. So a couple of other small pros for this bike is that it does come with a center stand, which I think is just really nice for parking the bike or for doing chain maintenance or oil changes. Certainly it does lower the ground clearance just a little bit, but for a utilitarian bike like this, I think it's a nice feature to have. Moving around to the other side of the bike, one of the other nice features about the Trail 125 is, well, it has a Kickstarter, which is always a nice feature to have if you find yourself in a real jam. Another small pro to this bike is that it actually does come with a little toolbox. Now, when I say little, I mean little, but it is nice to just have that space to put the necessary tools you need to work on this bike. All right, so we've come to the end of the pros list. There's one last thing to say, and that is that this bike is just so dang friggin' fun, right? I love this bike. I love that it's a huge confidence builder. I love that I can just goof off on it. I can try skid outs. I can go on insane single track trail and not be so worried about, am I going to be able to turn it around if I have to, or am I going to get stuck somewhere and have to like back it out? And I just quite honestly feel fearless on it. You know, maybe that's being cocky, maybe that's hubris, but I do feel like right now, I'm not afraid to try things on this bike. So, with that said, let's get to the cons, because I think they're just as important. If all you've heard up till now is all the pros, you're probably signing on the dotted line, ready to buy one of these and call it a day. But I think it's worth noting that I have just as long a list of cons or negatives when it comes to this bike. Starting with number 1, the chain. So the chain on this bike that comes stock, well, there's no other way to put it. It's garbage. I've already had to adjust it twice in 600 miles. So I think a really important and profound negative or con to this bike that's worth noting, and probably actually quite close to home to a lot of you watching this video, is that these little machines are impossible to find right now. So of course that means there's long waiting lists, and the asking prices are really inflated right now. So that means if you're watching this video because you want to go out tomorrow and buy one, I'm sorry to tell you, you're going to be in for a long journey trying to track one down. Now the good news is that while that is a con, it's hopefully only a temporary one, and eventually the supply will catch up to the demand. Another negative to this bike, which I think is really important to note, that simply a lot of people aren't talking about, is the seat height. Now what I mean is that given that this is considered a Honda Mini Moto, I personally was expecting the seat height to be a little bit lower. And I was surprised when I sat on the bike that I could only barely flat foot on it. Now I have a 32-inch inseam, and I can just barely flat foot. And I know that one of the biggest draws to the Mini Moto line is for shorter riders. So if you are a shorter rider and you're thinking about getting this bike, just know that you're not going to be able to flat foot because the seat height is over 32 inches. So another noteworthy negative to this bike is that there is virtually no internal storage whatsoever anywhere on the bike, other than of course the toolbox in the back. So what I mean is there's no document compartment under the seat, there's no small compartment behind the license plate, there's no secret compartment that pops open with the key on the side like on the supercar. cub. So another partial negative to this bike is the semi-automatic clutch. Now, I just got finished talking about how it's this great thing, especially if you're starting on the bike or you're a brand new learner, which I do still believe. However, if you have any proficiency whatsoever on a bike, or you're simply trying to move on from beginner to an intermediate, it's really nice having that clutch up at your hand that you can feather and work, and just having that manual control. So along the lines of shifting, I do have to say, sadly, that I believe the heel shifter is a negative to this bike. I think it's gimmicky, I think it's hokey, and honestly, I think it just gets in the way. All right, let's pull over for a second and chat a little bit in the shade, shall we? Let the bike cool down a little bit. All right, so I'm going to move on to the bike's electrical systems for a minute and talk about two things that I think are a bit of a nuisance. The first being the battery. So I learned very quickly that the battery is mounted in a very awkward place, and on top of that, it's also incredibly difficult to get to the terminals if you want to wire anything to the battery. So let me back up for a second and explain why this matters. When I first got this bike, there were two electrical components that I wanted to install on it. One is the SAE battery tender plug and power outlet plug here on the back. Second thing is this USB power adapter, which I've got up here mounted on the front, which I use to charge my phone and other electronics. Both of those things had to be wired into the battery, and when I pulled this panel off to do that, I discovered very quickly that not only is the battery tucked really far down and hard to get to, but there is an awkward cover over the top of it, which is difficult to get off. And then on top of that, when you actually go to wire in your electrical components, there are only small slots for you to actually wire those eyelets through, making the whole process just wildly frustrating and difficult. So I mentioned the USB power outlet that I put in this bike, but something that I think is worth noting that I thought was just a little annoying was that up here by the instrument cluster when I got the bike, there was a pre-drilled hole here for a power outlet. However, you'll find that any of these that you buy aftermarket are just about a 0.5 millimeter too big in diameter to fit in the hole, which means you have to get in there with a Dremel and grind it out a little bit to actually get that to fit. So I thought that was a real frustrating nuisance as well, but I did find that everyone else online that put in a USB adapter had the same problem. A couple of other things that are sort of obvious cons of this bike is, well, it's not really meant for a passenger. Yes, people put little seats on the back, people put rear pegs on the back, but honestly, given the suspension and what this bike is, it's really just ideally meant for one person. So that's not a problem for me. I'm the only one in my family that rides, and so I don't have an issue with it. But if you are thinking about ever going 2-up on one of these, you might want to seriously consider a different bike because it's just not really meant for 2 passengers. So full disclosure, something that I do think is worth noting and may or may not be a con depending on who's watching, but for me was certainly a con, is the color. Now I do love that Louise is nice and bright red like she is, and this is sort of the quintessential Honda color, team red, all that good stuff. But I think if I had a choice, I would have absolutely picked one of the 2 other colors that you see in other markets. So specifically that sort of lima bean green, I don't know what's the official color, or that khaki army color. Both of those colors I think are fantastic, and they just speak to me a lot more than this bright red does. But that's not to say I'm not happy. Something I haven't talked about on this bike, which is actually both a pro and a con, are the ABS brakes. So with this new version of the Trail 125, it does come with ABS on the front brake only. Now that's really nice. For road riding, you've got ABS. That's a great feature to have. However, with that said, I have found that this particular ABS is incredibly sensitive off-road. This ABS will engage and twitch and freak out all the time on my front brake. I'll be going down a little section of trail and it'll start jittering and stuttering, and I have all sorts of issues. Now, people have commented, why don't you just pull the fuse, which I suppose I could do, but it's one of those things I just kind of don't think about it, and then before I realize it, it starts acting up, and then I'm like, I'll deal with it later, and I just kind of leave it in. And there's no way to disengage the ABS. There's no switch, so you're stuck with it. On the topic of color, I think it's worth noting that because this bike is bright red, and because of the aforementioned high demand for this bike? Well, it's just really darn conspicuous. So that's just something to keep in mind. Owning one of these does come with a certain level of anxiety that it could get picked up because it is such a high demand and practical little machine. So something that I do think is a con on this bike, but it's almost more of kind of a nostalgic con, is that this version of the new Trail 125 does not come with that classic Honda Trail spare fuel canister. And man, that thing was so cool. And not only did it look cool because it had that sort of quintessential canteen look to it, but it was really practical. So something else that I think is worth noting that is a negative about this bike, it's sort of a functional negative, has to do with the handlebars. So you may notice I've got handguards on the front of the bike, but they're the real floppy kind of handguards. The engineers at Honda, in their infinite wisdom, decided to put rotating bar end weights in the handlebars. So you can see I can actually spin this, right? And so what that means is if you want to connect 2-point handguards, they're either going to be mobile and be awkward and kind of defeat the purpose of having fixed handguards, or you have to remove these bar end weights and replace them with something else. And I watched the videos on how to do that, and I will tell you it is not a simple job. And I just decided it wasn't worth it to me to mess around and really tear apart my brand new bike. And so if you're thinking about getting really nice handguards, just know that it is major operation on the bike. Something else that I think is worth noting that's a negative of this bike is that a lot of people will deck them out with boatloads of accessories. But just know that a lot of the accessories for this bike are only sold overseas in either Japan or Indonesia or Thailand. And while the accessories themselves are decently priced, the shipping to get those accessories to the United States is out of control. Just be careful of websites like Bees Deals and WeBike, all these sites that people rave about. Yes, they've got cool accessories, but just know that you are going to spend a fortune on shipping. And honestly, you're getting gouged. All right, well, we've made it to the end of the list of negatives, and we have come to the largest of elephants in the proverbial room. And that is top speed and performance. So let me lay it out to you straight, because you can watch 1,000 videos of people arguing about the capability of this bike and what the top speed is, and hey, I rode mine across the entire country, so I know it's fine. And yes, this bike is incredibly capable. Yes, you could absolutely ride it across the country on back roads, but you must understand that it is a 125cc displacement bike. It is a quote-unquote Honda Mini Moto. It is something like 9 horsepower. So do not buy this bike if you plan on doing any significant large highway riding. Okay? This bike can barely even handle secondary highways. So we're coming out on Lake Mary Road right here. This is a secondary highway. Speed limit on this road is 55. I have to be careful on my spacing on this road because even fully wrung out, I can't keep up with traffic on it. For all intents and purposes, this bike cannot handle highways. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you're gonna watch right here. I'm getting on this highway. I will ring it out as fast as it can possibly go. And you'll see the top speed on this bike on a slight descent is maybe 55. Most of the time when I look down, I'll be going 47, 48, maybe 50. So look, you can see right now I'm going 52 and I've got the throttle completely wide open, and that's it. That's all she's got, right? So I'm not even maintaining the speed limit on this road. So you have to understand that that is a major limitation with this bike. So that's why I say this bike is a fantastic commuter, it's a fantastic trail bike, it's a fantastic camp bike or farm bike, but it is not a fantastic adventure bike, at least in my opinion. I think if you want a small displacement adventure bike or dual sport, buy a CRF 300, buy an XT 250, right? not much bigger, and you're going to be able to ride on the highways, even if not very well. So that's as honest as I can get with you about that. I know you're going to try to convince yourself, you're going to watch a video and someone's going to have theirs up to 60 and you're going to be like, haha, see, it does get up to 60, but I'm telling you, it doesn't. Consider the top practical speed of this bike to be 50 miles per hour, and I think you'll be set. I absolutely love my bike, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. But remember, this is my scooter replacement. It is not a small ADV bike, as much as people might argue that it is. And I know that's my opinion, but I do firmly believe that, and it keeps me sort of in check, and it keeps me within the bounds of reality, because I'm not expecting more out of this little machine than it has. And I'm a realist, and I treat this bike for what it is, and I enjoy it for what it is. So with that, we are home. Okay, wow. Well, you've actually made it to the end of this way too long video, so I do appreciate it. I thank you. In all the time I spent editing this and cutting it together, I realized there were several pros and cons I left out, so I'm just gonna show a quick list to include a few things that I forgot. But otherwise, thank you so much for sticking around for almost 30 minutes. Take care, be safe, and I will see you in a new video that's hopefully a little bit more action-packed and fun. See you guys.